The morning Myrtle Townsend arrived at the Kendrick Ranch. She was carrying a cast-iron skillet in one hand and a carpet bag in the other, and every single cowhand on the property stopped whatever he was doing just to stare. It was the spring of 1882, deep in the Texas Panhandle, where the wind never truly stopped, and the sky stretched so wide it made a person feel both free and frightened all at once. The dust on the road into the ranch had coated the hem of Myrtle's traveling dress a deep burnt orange, and her dark hair had come half loose from its pins somewhere between the town of Caldwell Creek and the iron gate that bore the Kendrick brand. She was 26 years old, handsome in the way of a woman who had worked hard all her life and wore the evidence of it with dignity rather than apology. Her eyes were a warm, steady brown, and her jaw was set in the particular way of a person who had already decided, before they even arrived somewhere, that they would not be turned away. She had answered an advertisement placed in the Caldwell Creek Gazette by a man named Vernon Kendrick, who ran one of the largest cattle operations in Palo Duro country. The notice had been plain and without poetry. It read, "Wanted, a cook for a working ranch crew of 12 men. Must be capable of preparing 3 meals daily, managing a cook fire and a wood stove, and keeping a clean kitchen. Wages $12 a month plus room and board. No drinkers, no shirkers, no nonsense. Inquire at the Kendrick Ranch, 7 miles east of Caldwell Creek." Myrtle had read that notice standing in the dry goods store while her employer's shopping list was being filled, and something about the bluntness of it had appealed to her. She had spent the last 4 years cooking for the Hale family in town, a domestic position that was respectable enough, but that had grown increasingly suffocating as old Mrs. Hale developed the opinion that Myrtle needed supervision in everything from how she boiled an egg to how she arranged her own hair. Myrtle had given her notice the very afternoon she read that advertisement, folded the clipping neatly into her dress pocket, and begun making her arrangements. She had not precisely telegraphed ahead that the new cook would be a woman. The ranch foreman, a leathery man of perhaps 50 called Silas Greer, met her at the gate with an expression that traveled rapidly through several emotions before settling, unhappily, on resignation. He took off his hat, turned it in his hands, and said, "Ma'am, I believe there may have been some misunderstanding. Mr. Kendrick placed a notice for a cook," Myrtle said pleasantly. "I am a cook. There is no misunderstanding that I can identify." Silas Greer opened his mouth and then closed it again. He was not an unkind man, but he was a man of the era, which meant he had a tidy collection of assumptions that had never been seriously challenged. He looked at the cast-iron skillet in her hand, then at the carpet bag, then back at her face. "The boss is going to want to have a word," he said finally. "I would expect nothing less," Myrtle said. He led her across the hard packed yard toward the main house, a long, low structure of pale limestone that had been added onto in stages, so that it sprawled in a practical rather than elegant fashion. The cowhands who had paused in their work resumed it, though not before exchanging a good many glances that Myrtle chose to observe and then set aside. She had been looked at with doubt before. She had, without exception, cooked a meal that changed the nature of that doubt entirely. Vernon Kendrick was at his desk in the room off the main hall that served as his office, going over the books with the concentrated frown of a man who had been finding more expenses than income for 3 months running and was becoming genuinely tired of it. He was 34, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that was overdue for a cut, and the particular weathered tan that came from years of working outdoors regardless of season. He was not a pretty man in the way of illustrations, but he was striking in the way of things built to last, with a firm jaw and dark eyes that tended to take in a great deal before he said anything. He looked up when Silas rapped on the doorframe, and then he looked at Myrtle, and his expression went through a similar sequence to Silas's, though rather faster. "Mr. Kendrick," Silas said, sounding as though he were a man reporting the arrival of an unexpected weather system. "The new cook is here." Vernon set down his pen. He said nothing for a moment, which Myrtle later understood was characteristic of him. He was a man who thought before he spoke, which she found over time to be one of his finest qualities, though at that first meeting it made her slightly nervous because she could not read his thoughts. "Miss," he said at last. "Mrs. Townsend," she said. "Though I am widowed, so Miss or Mrs. is equally correct. I answer to both." "Mrs. Townsend," he repeated. He stood up, which was courteous, and he was taller than she had expected, which was simply a fact. "I placed that notice expecting a man." "Men frequently make fine cooks," Myrtle agreed. "So do women. In my experience, the quality of the cooking depends less on the sex of the cook and more on whether they know what they are doing. I know what I am doing, Mr. Kendrick." He looked at the skillet again. It was a very good skillet, heavy and well seasoned, the kind that only came from years of proper use. "What can you cook?" he asked. "Biscuits, cornbread, sourdough, pies, roast beef, venison stew, salt pork, beans 17 different ways, eggs any style, johnny cakes, dried apple cake, molasses bread, chicken and dumplings when chickens are available, and anything reasonable you care to put in front of me that I haven't mentioned," she said. "I can also make coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, which I have been told is a necessary qualification in working ranch kitchens." Something moved at the corner of Vernon Kendrick's mouth. It was not quite a smile, but it was the ghost of one. "It is," he said. "Sit down, Mrs. Townsend." She sat. Silas remained in the doorway, looking like a man watching a fuse burn. Vernon asked her questions for the better part of an hour. He was thorough and direct, and he did not condescend to her, which she appreciated enormously. He asked about her experience, her references, her capacity for managing a supply order, her thoughts on handling a large wood stove, her position on using rendered lard versus butter in biscuit dough. She answered every question fully and without embellishment, because she had learned long ago that the truth was a faster route to earning trust than any amount of performance. At the end of it, he leaned back in his chair and studied her with those dark eyes, and she met his gaze without looking away because she had not ridden 7 miles in the dust and Texas wind to be looked away from. "The men may not take to having a woman cook," he said, not unkindly. "The men," she said, "will take to eating well, and that is generally enough." He was quiet again. Then he said, "The cook's quarters are attached to the kitchen. Small but private. You'd have a lock on the door." "That is all I would require," she said. $12 a month as advertised," he said. "Sundays you have the afternoon off after midday meal. That is acceptable." He extended his hand across the desk, and she shook it, and the deal was struck, and Myrtle Townsend became the cook of the Kendrick Ranch. The kitchen was everything the main house was not, which was to say it was neither modest nor plain. Someone, at some point in the history of the ranch, had put genuine thought and investment into this room. There was a large cast iron range with 6 burners and a broad oven, connected to a stone chimney that drew well. There were long pine work tables, scrubbed pale. There were hooks and shelves in excellent order, a deep dry pantry, and a window over the washing basin that looked out toward the eastern pasture where, in the early morning, Myrtle could already see the shapes of cattle moving slow and heavy through the new grass. The cook's room beyond was indeed small, but it had a proper bed with a rope frame and a corn husk mattress, a washstand, and a window that let in the morning light. She unpacked her carpet bag, put her skillet on a hook where she could reach it easily, and began taking inventory of what was in the pantry. She found it reasonably well stocked, but without much imagination. There were barrels of flour, cornmeal, dried beans, and dried peas. There was salt pork in quantity, and a good supply of coffee beans. There were dried chilies strung along one rafter, which she approved of. There was very little in the way of sweetening, which she did not approve of, because in her considerable experience, a crew of working men who never got anything sweet became a crew of working men with low morale and short tempers. She made a list that was 2 pages long and handed it to Silas Greer before supper, explaining that she would need these items within the week from the supply store in Caldwell Creek if she was to do her job properly. Silas looked at the list the way a man looks at a document he suspects will cost him money, which it was, and took it without comment. Her first meal for the crew was supper that very evening, which did not leave her much time, but she had never in her life let the available time determine the quality of the food. She made a large pot of pinto beans that she seasoned aggressively with the dried chilies and onions she found in the kitchen, a skillet of cornbread cooked golden and cut into thick squares, and slices of salt pork fried crisp. She made coffee in a pot large enough to serve a small army, which was more or less what 12 cowhands constituted. The men came in from the day's work in the rolling, boot-scraping way of tired men everywhere, and they found a clean table and full plates and strong coffee waiting for them. And for a long moment, there was the particular silence of people who have been genuinely surprised by something. Then they started eating, and the silence became something different entirely. The concentrated, appreciative quiet of people engaged with food that deserved their full attention. Myrtle stayed by the stove and watched without appearing to watch, and she noted who ate what and how quickly, because knowing what a person ate and how they ate it told you a great deal about what they needed and what they were missing. The men were polite to her in varying degrees, ranging from a young hand named Tommy Ray's who thanked her with genuine warmth and scraped his bowl clean twice, to a heavy-set man named Clyde Burkett who said nothing and looked at her sideways all evening, as though he was still deciding something. Vernon Kendrick sat at the head of the table, as was appropriate, and he ate with the same steady focus he brought to everything, and he said, when he was finished, "That was very good, Mrs. Townsend." It was a simple thing to say, but he said it in a way that meant exactly what it said, and Myrtle, who had been cooking professionally for the better part of 8 years and had been thanked in many ways and degrees, felt that his particular manner of saying it was worth more than most of the fulsome praise she had received over the years. "Thank you, Mr. Kendrick," she said. "I will have oatmeal with molasses and eggs in the morning, and I would appreciate knowing by what hour the men need to be fed." "5:30, he said. She nodded and began clearing the table, and the business of the Kendrick Ranch continued. The weeks that followed were full and demanding in the good way of work that has real purpose. Myrtle rose before 4 every morning to get the stove going and have the coffee ready by 5, and she did not sit down until after the midday meal was served and cleaned up, at which point she had roughly 2 hours before she needed to begin supper preparations. In those 2 hours she did her supply ordering, mended her own things, wrote in the small journal she had kept since her years in Missouri, and occasionally simply sat on the low bench outside the kitchen door and looked at the enormous Texas sky. She grew to know the men individually, the way a cook always does, because feeding people is an intimate act even when it is entirely professional. Tommy Ray's was 20 years old and homesick for his mother's cooking in San Antonio, and could be made happy by any dish that included peppers and cumin. Silas Greer had a bad tooth that meant he avoided anything too hard or too cold, which she accommodated without being asked, softening his cornbread and warming his morning coffee to a degree below scalding. There were the Mackay brothers, Finn and Declan, Irish immigrants who had come west after the rail lines were laid and stayed, because the landscape appealed to their particular variety of melancholy. There was old Pete Dawson, who had been on the ranch longer than anyone except Silas, and who ate with the serious satisfaction of a man who knew that a good meal was one of life's genuine pleasures. And then there was Vernon Kendrick himself, who ate at the crew table because he believed in working beside his men rather than above them, and who she came to know in the way she knew all of them, through observation and proximity and the slow accumulation of small things. She noticed that he took his coffee black and very hot, and that he was capable of drinking it before it had properly cooled without seeming to notice the temperature. She noticed that he always ate everything on his plate, and that he had a particular fondness for anything made with dried apple, which she began incorporating into her baking more frequently once she identified this preference. She noticed that he read in the evenings actual books, which was less common than she would have liked in any setting, and more uncommon still among working ranchers, and that he kept a small shelf of them in the office where she sometimes delivered his coffee when he was working late and the kitchen was already cleaned. She noticed that he watched her sometimes when he thought she would not catch him at it. She always caught him at it, because she had learned, over the course of a life that had not always been easy, to be aware of who was looking at her and why. But the way Vernon Kendrick looked at her was not the way of a man with bad intentions. It was the look of a person who has encountered something they did not expect and are still working out what to make of it. She found it more interesting than troubling, which told her something about herself. It was in the 5th week of her employment that the first serious difficulty arrived, in the form of Clyde Burkett making a loud and unfriendly comment during supper about women on working ranches, delivered in the general direction of the table, but clearly intended for her ears and the ears of anyone who might agree with him. He said that he had worked for outfits from Kansas to New Mexico, and that in his experience a cook's job was a man's job, and that the boss's judgment on this particular matter was, with all due respect, mistaken. The table went quiet in the particular way of men who are curious about how a situation will resolve and have not yet decided whether to be involved in the resolution. Myrtle set down the pot she was holding and looked at Clyde Burkett with the steady, unhurried attention she gave to all problems that required actual thought. "Mr. Burkett," she said, "you are welcome to cook your own meals if you find mine unsatisfactory. The stove is available from 7 in the evening until 4 in the morning, which leaves you ample time for the project. Otherwise, I would suggest that my employment here is a matter between myself and Mr. Kendrick, and that the food in front of you is getting cold." There was a brief, sharp silence. Then Tommy Reyes, bless him, picked up his fork and started eating, and one by one the others followed, and the moment dissolved. Vernon Kendrick, she noticed, had said nothing during this exchange. He had looked at Clyde Burkett and then at her, and his expression had been difficult to read. After supper, when the men had gone, he came to the kitchen door. "Mrs. Townsend," he said. "Mr. Kendrick," she said, washing the heavy pot without turning around. "You handled that well." "I've handled worse," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I could speak to Burkett." She turned then, drying her hands on her apron. "I would rather you didn't," she said. "Not yet. It would look as though I needed defending, and it is better if the men come to their own conclusions about me." He studied her with those dark eyes for longer than was strictly necessary, and then he nodded and said good night and left. But she noticed in the days that followed that he watched her with a quality of attention that had shifted slightly, become more specific, as though he had decided something about her and was checking it against the evidence. It was in the 7th week that the thing happened which would, though neither of them knew it at the time, change the entire character of their situation. A fever came through the bunkhouse. It arrived quietly, the way fevers always do, with one man feeling poorly at supper and 2 more feeling poorly by breakfast. And within 4 days 8 of the 12 hands were down with a raging summer fever that left them sweating and weak and incapable of working. Vernon sent to Caldwell Creek for the doctor, a practical woman named Dr. Ansel Pratt, who arrived brisk and competent, and declared it a seasonal fever of the kind that swept through working camps in the heat of summer, contagious among men who slept in close quarters, and ordered strict rest, plenty of fluids, and simple food until the fever broke. Myrtle added the nursing duties to her cooking without being asked, because there was no one else to do it, and the men were genuinely miserable. She made thin broths and weak teas and kept cool, wet cloths at their foreheads, moving through the bunkhouse with the efficiency of a woman who had nursed her own husband through a long dying and knew the shape of serious illness. She did not think of it as extraordinary. It was work that needed doing, and she was there to do it. The men who were well enough to be on their feet were Vernon, Silas, Tommy Rays, and the Mackay brothers, who turned out to have a natural resistance that they attributed to their Irish blood with rather more pride than was scientifically warranted. They kept the essential ranch functions running. Vernon was out before dawn and back after dark every day of that week, and Myrtle made sure there was always something hot and sustaining waiting for him regardless of the hour. One night toward the end of that bad week, she found him at the kitchen table at what must have been 11 o'clock, still in his dusty work clothes, too tired to move and too hungry to sleep, staring at the table with the expression of a man who has used up all of his reserves and is running on something past exhaustion into a country beyond it. She put coffee in front of him without a word, and then she took the cold roast beef that was left from supper and sliced it thin, and made him a plate with the last of the cornbread and a cup of the broth she had been making for the sick men, which was rich and restorative and had been simmering since morning. He ate everything. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and drank it slowly, and some of the terrible tension in his face began to ease. "How are they?" he said, meaning the sick men. "Pete Dawson and Danny Vance turned the corner today," she said, sitting down across from him because her feet hurt, and because it was 11 o'clock and there was no formality left in the evening. "Burkett is still bad. Jim Holt has been better since this morning. The others are somewhere in the middle." He nodded slowly. "The herd needs moving to the south pasture by Friday. Then you'll need to be alive and capable of moving it," she said, "which means you need to sleep. Is there anything else you need tonight?" He looked up from the coffee cup, and the look he gave her in the lamplight was different from any look he had given her before. It was not the assessing look of an employer, nor the curious look of a man trying to determine something. It was simply the look of a person who is genuinely grateful and does not entirely know how to say so. "No," he said quietly. "Thank you, Mrs. Townsend. I mean that." "I know you do," she said, and she took her lantern and went to bed, and she lay awake for a good while afterward looking at the ceiling and thinking about things she had not thought about in quite some time. The fever passed, as fevers do, and by the following week the bunkhouse was more or less back to its working capacity. The men who had been sick were sheepish and grateful, and a good deal less skeptical of Myrtle than they had been before, because being nursed through a bad illness by someone has a way of dissolving whatever reservations you might have had about that person. Even Clyde Burkett thanked her gruffly and without elaboration, which she accepted in the spirit in which it was offered. Life on the ranch returned to its rhythms. The cattle drive that Vernon had been working toward through the spring took shape across the summer, and the days grew longer and louder, and the kitchen was in constant motion from before dawn until well after dark. Myrtle expanded her repertoire for the season, making sourdough bread in large batches that held well, dried fruit pies for the sweet-hungry men, a spiced molasses cake that became so popular she had to hide a portion of it, or it would disappear before the intended occasion. She and Vernon developed, gradually and without either of them having planned for it, a habit of talking in the evenings after the men had dispersed. It had begun practically enough, with the daily debrief about supply needs and meal planning, but it had grown into something more various and honest than that. He talked about the ranch, its history and its future, with a frankness that she understood was not extended to most people. He had inherited the land from his father, who had claimed it in the early days of Texas settlement, and he had spent 12 years building it into what it was, through drought and hard winters, and the particular grinding difficulty of making land productive in country that had not been designed for ease. He carried the weight of it with the particular seriousness of a man who knows that the people who work for him depend on him not to fail. She talked, too, more than she had intended to at first. She told him about growing up in Missouri, the youngest daughter of a farming family, and how she had learned to cook from her mother and her grandmother and from sheer necessity, because there were 6 children and not always enough of anything, and ingenuity in the kitchen was a survival skill. She told him, One evening when it came up in a natural way, about her husband, a man named William Townsend who had been decent and kind, and who had died of a lung ailment 3 years previous, leaving her with no children and no property but with an extensive set of practical skills and the determined temperament required to use them. "Were you happy?" Vernon asked, not nosily but in the direct way he asked all questions that mattered to him. "Yes," she said after thinking about it honestly. "We were content, which I think is a better word than happy, because happy is something you feel on particular occasions and content is something you carry with you. We were content. I miss him, but not in the way that makes everything else impossible. I've learned to carry it." Vernon was quiet for a while after that. Then he said, "My fiancée left 4 years ago. We were to be married and she decided, about a month before the date, that ranch life was not the life she wanted." "I'm sorry," Myrtle said. "Don't be," he said, though not harshly. "She was right. She was a town woman entirely, and I was always going to be a rancher, and the kindest thing she did was to admit it before the wedding rather than after." "That was brave of her," Myrtle said. "I didn't think so at the time," he said, and then after another pause, "I think so now." Summer turned hard in July, the way Texas summers do, with a heat that pressed down on the land from a bleached white sky and made everything move more slowly and carefully than usual. Myrtle adapted the cooking to the heat, making cold dishes where possible, serving larger breakfasts and lighter midday meals, keeping the men hydrated with cool water and the mint tea she made in a large clay pot and set in the shade each morning. She had, without ever announcing it, begun to approach the feeding of these men as a kind of care, not merely as a transaction of labor, and they felt the difference even if they could not have articulated what it was. One afternoon in late July, Vernon found her in the kitchen making a medicinal poultice for a deep cut that young Tommy Ray's had gotten on his hand from a barbed wire fence. She was cleaning the wound with carbolic and explaining to Tommy, who was inclined to be dramatic about physical pain, that it was going to sting, but that getting it properly clean was better than the alternative, and she was holding his hand with a firm, practiced steadiness while she worked. Vernon stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, watching this with an expression that Myrtle did not see because she was focused on Tommy's hand, but that Silas Greer, passing behind him in the hall, observed clearly and filed away for future reference. That evening, after Tommy had been sent off with his hand bandaged and instructions for keeping it clean, Vernon came to the kitchen as he usually did, but he seemed less settled than usual, less certain of his conversational footing, and it took him longer than it typically did to find the thread of what he wanted to say. "You're good with people," he said finally. "Beyond the cooking, I mean. You have a way of knowing what a person needs." "I've had a lot of practice at reading people," she said. "It's what comes of feeding a large number of them regularly." "I don't think that's all it is," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the table in the way he sometimes did when he was saying something he had thought about more than the words themselves implied. "What is it then?" she asked. "I think you care about people," he said simply. "About whether they are all right." She considered this. "Is that something you find unusual?" she asked. "I find it uncommon," he said. "There's a difference." They were both quiet for a moment, and the evening outside was painted in the particular amber and rose of a Texas sunset that was trying to make up for the brutality of the day, and the kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee, and the dried herbs she kept in bundles along the window, and something in the quality of the silence between them had changed, had become less the silence of two people being professionally polite, and more the silence of two people aware of each other, in a way that exceeded the professional entirely. It was Vernon who looked away first, and then said something practical about the supply order for the following week, and Myrtle answered him practically, and they continued their evening in its usual way. But something had shifted, and they both knew it, and the knowing of it sat between them from then on like a stone in a stream, altering the current. The cattle drive that Vernon had been preparing for through the spring and summer was planned for September, and it would require taking the majority of the crew north to the rail terminus at Dodge City, a journey of several weeks. The planning for it consumed the ranch through August, and Myrtle was very much a part of that planning, because feeding a crew on a drive was an entirely different enterprise from feeding them at the ranch, requiring a carefully managed supply of preserved and portable foods, a chuck wagon, and the physical stamina to cook over an open fire at the end of 12-hour days on horseback. The question of who would serve as cook on the drive came up one morning at breakfast, and Myrtle did not volunteer for it because she was not certain she was wanted, but she did not volunteer either. She simply listened. Vernon looked at her across the table and said, "Mrs. Townsend, how do you feel about a cattle drive?" "I feel that cattle need feeding at the end of one the same as any other creature," she said. "That's not a no," said Tommy Reyes, grinning. "It is not a no," she agreed. Vernon looked at her for another moment and then said, "I'll need you on the drive, if you're willing." "I'm willing," she said. The drive went out in the second week of September, 12 hands and a cook and a boss, and a herd of over 1,000 longhorns that moved across the land in a shifting river of brown and rust and cream. The days were exactly as hard as Myrtle had expected, and the cooking was exactly as demanding, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she loved it with a completeness she had not anticipated. There was something about cooking at the open fire under a sky so full of stars, it seemed impossible that it could hold them all, with the smell of the cattle and the grass and the night wind, that felt like the truest version of what she had been doing all her life. The men came in each evening from their watches and their riding with the particular hollow hunger of people who have spent the day moving large animals over difficult terrain, and she fed them with everything she had, and they ate with a gratitude that was entirely unperformed. Vernon rode the herd all day and came in late, and she kept his supper warm, and they sat by the fire when everyone else had gone to their bedrolls, and they talked in the particular freedom that comes from being out under the open sky with the ordinary world suspended. He told her things on that drive that he had not told her in all the evenings at the kitchen table. He told her about his father, a hard and frequently unkind man who had been magnificent at building things and terrible at maintaining relationships, and about how Vernon had spent a long time trying to be different from him and was still not entirely certain he had succeeded. He told her about the ranch's financial difficulties, the previous 2 years of poor market prices and expensive repairs that had put him behind in a way he was working hard to recover from. He told her these things not as confessions, but as information freely given to a person he trusted, and Myrtle understood that the trust itself was the most significant thing. She told him things too. She told him about the years after William died, when she had felt profoundly alone in a way that was different from loneliness, because it was not the absence of company, but the absence of being truly known by another person. She told him about the satisfaction she had found in cooking, in the way it was both a practical service and a form of affection simultaneously. She told him that she had not expected, when she answered his advertisement, to find herself somewhere that felt like it might become home. He looked at her across the fire when she said that, and the firelight was doing remarkable things to the planes of his face, and she thought, not for the first time and with more certainty than before, that he was a very good man, which was not the same as a comfortable man or an easy man, but which was the thing that mattered most. "Is it starting to feel like home?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she said honestly. "I think it is." He did not say anything more than that night, but he looked at her for a long moment before he went to check on the night watch, and she sat by the fire a little longer than she needed to, watching the coals and thinking. The drive reached Dodge City in early October, and the selling of the cattle went well enough to ease the financial pressure that had been sitting on Vernon's shoulders all year, and the men were in high spirits on the return journey, which was faster without the herd. Myrtle rode in the chuck wagon alongside the Mackay brothers, who spent the entire trip south playing cards and arguing about the rules in a good-natured way that made the miles pass pleasantly. When they arrived back at the Kendrick Ranch in the third week of October, there was a telegram waiting for Vernon from the land office in Austin, and from the way his face changed when he read it, Myrtle could see it was not good news. She did not ask about it that day, because it was not her business to ask. But she made sure supper that evening was particularly good, the kind of meal that communicates care without stating it plainly, a rich beef stew with fresh cornbread, and a dried apple cake that she had been saving the ingredients for. And she made his coffee the exact way he liked it, and set it on the table next to his plate without comment. He looked at the table and then at her, and he said, "You always know." "Know what?" she asked. "When something needs making better," he said, "and how to do it without being asked." She looked at him steadily and said, "Eat while it is hot, Mr. Kendrick." He almost smiled. Then he said, "Vernon." She paused. "Pardon." "My name," he said. "I think it's been long enough for that, don't you?" She considered him across the kitchen, this serious, steady, complicated man who had given her a place and a purpose, and turned out to be, beneath the roughness of all that practical plainness, someone she had come genuinely to rely on for the pleasure of his company. "Yes," she said. "I think it has been long enough." "Vernon." He said her name in return, Myrtle, which was the first time he had used it, and the sound of it in his voice was something she felt rather than merely heard. The telegram, as it turned out, was about a contested piece of the ranch's boundary land, a section along the creek that a neighboring operation called the Alderton Outfit had been claiming for 2 years. The Alderton family was headed by a man named Curtis Alderton, who was the kind of man who believed strongly in property rights when they were his, and considerably less strongly when they belonged to someone else. He had filed a claim with the land office asserting that the creek boundary had been misdescribed in Vernon's original title, and that the 50 acres along it properly belonged to the Alderton spread. Vernon spent several days writing the boundary and reviewing his father's original land documents, and Myrtle could see the toll it was taking, not because he showed it dramatically, but because she had learned to read the particular quality of his silences. She watched him go through his papers at the kitchen table one evening after everyone else had gone to bed, spreading maps and documents across the table, with the focused unhappiness of a man searching for something he needs to find. "Tell me what you're looking for," she said. He looked up surprised and then explained the situation in full. She listened, and then she said, "And your father's original deed of title, the document that described the boundary to begin with." "That's what I can't find," he said. "It should be in the office files, but it isn't." "Where else might it be?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he said, "My father kept a strongbox. It went to my sister when he died. She's in Amarillo." He wrote to his sister that evening, and the document arrived 3 weeks later and proved exactly what Vernon had known it would prove, that the boundary had been correctly described and the Alderton claim was without merit. The matter was resolved through the land office without the need for anything more dramatic, and Curtis Alderton retreated to nurse his grievance privately, which is where, Myrtle felt, it properly belonged. The evening the resolution came, Vernon came to the kitchen where she was cleaning up and stood in the doorway with the letter in his hand and said, "The boundary claim is settled, in our favor." "I knew it would be," she said. "How did you know?" "Because you were right," she said. "And you knew you were right, and you were simply looking for the document that proved it. A man who knows he is right is a very hard man to argue with when he has his evidence." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he crossed the kitchen, which was not a large space, and he was standing close enough that she could see the specific quality of his expression clearly, which was something she had come to know very well over these months and which told her, with a certainty that did not require translation, exactly what he was feeling. "Myrtle," he said, in the voice he used for things that mattered. "Vernon," she said. "I've been trying to find the right way to say something," he said. "I'm not a man who is easy with words when they count. "I've noticed," she said, and the gentleness in her voice was not teasing but fond. "I don't want you to be just the cook here," he said. "I think you know that. I think I've made it fairly obvious these past months, even when I was trying not to." "You have been somewhat obvious," she agreed. "What I want," he said carefully, "is to ask you if there is any part of you that might want the same thing I want, which is not to lose you from this ranch or from my life when your employment might take you somewhere else." He paused. "I want to ask you to stay properly. In every sense of that word." Myrtle looked at this man who had given her honest work and a decent place, and his own slow, careful, genuine attention, and she thought of the kitchen in the mornings, with the light coming through the eastern window, and the smell of coffee, and the sound of the men coming in for breakfast. And she thought of the drive under the enormous stars, and the long evenings at the table, and her name in his voice that first time he had used it, and she said what she knew to be true. "I was already thinking about staying," she said. "You did not need to ask." Something in him eased, the particular tension of a man who has been braced for the answer and has received the one he hoped for, and he took her hand and held it with the careful deliberateness of a man who intends to hold on. "I would very much like to court you properly," he said, "if that is agreeable to you." "It is agreeable to me," she said, "on the condition that you continue to be as honest with me as you have been, and that you never once make the mistake of thinking that because I cook your meals I am less than your equal." "I have never thought that for a single day," he said, and she believed him completely. He kissed her hand, which was formal and a little old-fashioned and entirely in keeping with who he was, and she held the warmth of his grip for a long time after he had said good night. The courtship that followed was, like everything about Vernon Kendrick, serious and direct and without unnecessary ornament, which suited Myrtle entirely. He brought her things, not expensive things because the ranch budget did not permit expensive things, but thoughtful things, a small book of poetry that he had found in the mercantile in Caldwell Creek, a bunch of prairie wildflowers that someone less practical might have thought beneath notice, but which she put in a tin cup on the kitchen windowsill and kept until they had gone entirely to seed. He walked with her on Sunday afternoons when her time was her own, out along the creek boundary where the cottonwoods were turning gold in the October light, and they talked with the ease of people who have already said the difficult things and found nothing there to fear. He told her more about himself on those walks than he had in all the preceding months, not because he had been withholding, but because trust is a structure that builds in its own time and cannot be hurried. He told her about his loneliness, the particular kind that comes from being responsible for many people while being known by none of them in the ways that matter most. He told her that he had watched her in those first weeks, with something that was not yet what it became, but that was already more than professional interest, and that he had spent considerable time trying to talk himself out of it on the grounds that she was in his employ, and that it would be improper. "What changed your mind?" she asked. "The night of the fever," he said. "When I came in and you had left the supper and you sat down across from me because it was late and there was no formality left. You looked at me as an equal and you spoke to me as an equal, and I realized that whatever I had been telling myself about what was proper, the reality was simpler than that. I simply wanted to keep talking to you for as long as you would permit it." "That," she said, "is the most genuinely romantic thing anyone has ever said to me, and it involves very little poetry." He looked at her sideways with the expression that was not quite a smile but was better than one. "I did try to find a poem for you," he said. "I know," she said. "I read it. Did you like it?" "I thought the poem was adequate," she said, "but I thought the fact that you looked for it was perfect." He stopped walking and faced her there in the October afternoon among the cottonwoods, and he said, "Myrtle, will you marry me? I am asking plainly because I am not capable of asking any other way, and I would rather ask plainly and have a plain answer than perform something neither of us would believe." She looked at him, this plain, serious, good man with his dust and his responsibilities and his quiet devotion to the land and the people on it, and she thought that she had spent enough of her life with contentment to recognize love when it arrived, and that love was richer and more complex and more worth having, and that she was not too old or too sensible or too widowed to want it. "Yes, Vernon," she said, "I will marry you, plainly and completely and for every reason that matters." He took her face in both hands and kissed her, there in the cottonwood light, and it was exactly as she would have wanted it to be if she had been asked to describe what a kiss from him would feel like, which was to say that it was unhurried and honest and wholly present, the kiss of a man who intends it to be the beginning of something rather than a conclusion. They were married in the first week of December, in the small white church in Caldwell Creek, on a cold, bright morning when the frost was still on the grass, and the sky was the particular hard blue of a Texas winter. The entire crew attended, scrubbed and uncomfortable in their good clothes and genuinely happy, which is the best kind of wedding audience. Silas Greer stood up for Vernon, and Vernon's sister Alma, who had come down from Amarillo with her husband and children for the occasion, stood up for Myrtle. Tommy Reyes cried freely and without embarrassment, which endeared him to everyone present. The minister was a young man from Ohio, who had been in Caldwell Creek for 2 years, and had not yet lost his slightly startled expression at the general character of West Texas life. He married them with great sincerity, and only mild confusion at the way the congregation kept addressing each other informally during what was supposed to be a formal ceremony. Myrtle wore a dress of dark green wool that Alma had insisted on helping her make, saying that a woman who spent her days in an apron deserved to get married in something genuinely fine. It was finer than anything Myrtle had worn in years, and she wore it with the dignity of someone who has worked hard enough to have earned beautiful things. Vernon wore his best suit and his Sunday boots and looked, as Tommy Reyes said afterward, like a man who had finally figured out what he was supposed to be doing with his life, which Myrtle thought was exactly right. After the ceremony and a substantial wedding supper that Myrtle had planned and Alma had helped prepare in the church hall, involving roast beef and 3 kinds of pie and enough coffee to satisfy even the most demanding of the assembled cowhands, they went back to the ranch together. The crew had decorated the main house door with dried wildflowers and a horseshoe hung for luck, which was clumsy and heartfelt, and exactly the right thing. Winter on the ranch was quieter than the other seasons, and the weeks after the wedding were the warmest winter that Myrtle had known since her childhood in Missouri, not because the temperature was mild, because it was not, but because the quality of the life she was living had changed in a way that touched everything. She was still the cook. She did not stop being the cook because she had become the boss's wife. That would have been both impractical and contrary to her nature. She got up before 4 and she made the coffee, and she fed the crew, and she managed the kitchen with the same thoroughness she always had, and Vernon did not suggest that she should stop, because he had learned enough about her to know that the cooking was not servitude but vocation, and that to take it from her would be to take something essential. What changed was the evenings, and the mornings before the rest of the ranch was awake, and the texture of belonging to a place and a person in a way that was permanent and chosen and reciprocal. She learned the house, really learned it, the way you learn a place only when you live in it fully rather than professionally. She rearranged the main room with Vernon's permission, and then with his enthusiastic agreement once he saw what she did with it, moving the furniture so that the long evening light came through the windows at the best angle, adding the wool rugs that his sister had insisted they take from her wagon, because she had brought more than she could use, building a small shelf for books beside the fireplace, because 2 people who both liked to read in the evenings required proper infrastructure for it. Vernon went through the early months of their marriage with a quality of wonder that he tried to keep private and did not entirely succeed at, which Myrtle found genuinely endearing. He was a man who had been alone in his own life for a long time, and the presence of another person in all the ordinary places was something he was still adjusting to, and the adjustment was clearly pleasurable in a way he had not anticipated. He brought her coffee in the mornings when she was not yet in the kitchen, carrying it to her with the same focused care he brought to the cattle accounts, which she thought was one of the most romantic gestures she had ever received, because it was entirely characteristic of him. He asked her opinion on ranch decisions, and listened to her answers with the seriousness of a man who considers the source credible. He argued with her when he disagreed, which she had expected and which she respected, because a man who agrees with everything you say is a man who is not paying proper attention. By February they knew she was expecting a child, which they did not announce immediately, but which Silas Greer appeared to have deduced independently from the way Vernon had started hovering near doorways when Myrtle was lifting anything, which Silas communicated to the rest of the crew in the subtle way of foremen everywhere, so that by March the whole ranch was treating her with a slightly more elevated degree of care that she found both touching and somewhat excessive. Spring came in again, the second spring of Myrtle's life on the Kendrick Ranch, and it was different from the first in almost every way and the same in all the ways that mattered. The cook fire still burned before dawn, and the coffee was still strong enough to stand a spoon in, and the crew still came in from the early work hollow and grateful, and the Texas sky still stretched to a width that made a person feel both free and frightened, though Myrtle now felt more free than frightened, which she understood to be a measure of how deeply she had come to belong here. Tommy Reyes was now 22 and deeply in love with a girl from Caldwell Creek named Rosa Fuentes, whom he brought to Sunday supper one afternoon in April with the particular nervous pride of a young man, presenting the most important thing he owns to the people whose opinion matters most to him. Rosa was small and sharp-eyed and funny, and she spoke to Myrtle with the directness of someone recognizing a kindred spirit across a dinner table, and Myrtle liked her immediately and thoroughly. Vernon observed this exchange with the quiet satisfaction of a man watching his world fill up with good things. Old Pete Dawson, who had spent 30 years on working ranches and who had no family that anyone knew of, had developed a habit since the fever of sitting on the bench outside the kitchen door for a while after supper, and Myrtle had developed a corresponding habit of sometimes joining him there for a cup of tea while the day settled. They talked about nothing in particular, the weather and the cattle and the state of the road to Caldwell Creek, but the talking was not the point. The point was the company. She had come to think of him as something like a difficult uncle, which he would have found greatly amusing if she had told him, which she did not, because he was old Pete Dawson, and he did not require being told about his own significance. In August, a boy was born. They named him William, for Myrtle's first husband, and James, for Vernon's grandfather, and he arrived in a strong, loud manner at 3 o'clock in the morning with Dr. Pratt in attendance and Vernon sitting in the hall in a state of complete suspended animation that Silas Greer, also in the hall and also quite still, found profoundly relatable. When Dr. Pratt opened the door and said, "You have a healthy son, Mr. Kendrick," Vernon stood up from his chair and said, "Thank you," in a voice that was not entirely steady, and he went in to where Myrtle was propped against the pillows with the baby in her arms, and she looked up at him with an expression that was exhausted and radiant and entirely certain, and he sat beside her and held her hand and looked at his son with the face of a man who has not yet learned the full proportions of what he is feeling. "He looks like you," Myrtle said. "He looks like a very small, very angry person," Vernon said, "who I fully intend to spend the rest of my life making happy." "That is the correct approach," she said. He leaned his forehead against hers, gently, and they stayed like that for a while in the quiet room with the baby between them, while outside the August night made its usual sounds and the ranch slept, and the world continued its business without requiring their attention for once. William James Kendrick grew, as babies invariably do, from a small and loud and demanding presence into a small and loud and demanding person, with opinions about horses, and an attachment to old Pete Dawson that made the old cowhand visibly uncomfortable and secretly delighted in equal measure. By the time William was 2 and walking with the concentrated determination of a small human trying to keep up with the world, the ranch had taken on the quality of a genuinely lived-in place, the kind that absorbs the personality of the people who are happy in it. The crew had changed in small ways over those years. Clyde Burkett had moved on to another operation east of town, without ill will, simply because he was the kind of man who moved on periodically, and that was his nature. In his place, Vernon had hired a man named Abel Cross, who was quiet and efficient, and who ate Myrtle's cooking with a reverence that she found professionally gratifying. Tommy Reyes had married Rosa in the fall of the year William was born, in a wedding that involved more flowers and more dancing than Myrtle and Vernon's had, which was appropriate because Tommy was a man who required flowers and dancing in his celebrations. He still worked the ranch, and he was still the same Tommy she had known from the beginning, except that he had become, quietly and without announcing it, one of the most reliable hands on the property. The financial situation of the ranch, which had been strained when Myrtle first arrived, had gradually improved. The cattle drive of 1882 and the ones that followed had gone well, and Vernon had made a sensible decision to diversify into horses in 1883, working with a Comanche horse trader named Joseph Petta, who had a reputation for the finest quarter horses in the Panhandle. Their arrangement was one of mutual respect and practical benefit, and Myrtle had come to know Joseph Petta's wife, a woman named Clara who was half Comanche and half Spanish, and who knew more about medicinal plants than anyone else Myrtle had ever met. She and Clara had developed a friendship over several years built on shared knowledge and mutual curiosity that was one of the genuine unexpected gifts of Myrtle's life on the ranch. She acknowledged to herself, and when the subject arose in conversation, that the world these women navigated was one that offered Clara considerable less courtesy than it offered Myrtle, which was an injustice that she said plainly, and that Vernon, to his credit, agreed with plainly, and that neither of them could individually resolve but that they refused to pretend was not the truth. What they could do was treat Clara and Joseph Petta with the same direct respect they extended to everyone, and conduct their business fairly and without the condescension that was too common in such arrangements. It was not enough to correct the larger wrong, but it was the right thing, and they did it consistently. In the spring of 1885, when William was 2.5 and had just learned that horses were not toys, a second child arrived. This time it was a girl, born in the early afternoon on a day in April when the prairie was in the full flush of its brief and extravagant spring bloom. They named her Frances Alma, for Vernon's mother who had died young and his sister who had come down for the birth, and who cried in the excellent, uncomplicated way of women, who are genuinely happy without qualification. Frances was nothing like William, which was the first thing she established clearly by being, from birth, a person of deliberate and considered temperament, who looked at everything with the careful attention of someone taking notes. William, who had initially regarded the prospect of a sibling with suspicion, was won over entirely within the first week by the discovery that Frances would hold his finger very firmly if he put it in her hand, and from that point he regarded her as his personal discovery and showed her to people with the proprietary pride of someone who has found something rare. Vernon watched his children with the same quality of focused, grateful attention he had brought to everything in his life, and Myrtle watched him watch them, and the love between them had settled by now into something deeper and less visible than its early form, the way a river deepens as it moves, less dramatic on the surface but carrying so much more. There were still the evenings by the fire in the main room, the two of them reading or talking after the children were in bed and the ranch was quiet, and Vernon still made her coffee in the mornings with the same care, and she still cooked because she wanted to, not because she had to, and the kitchen was still the center of the ranch's life and her own. She had added a large herb garden along the south wall of the kitchen in 1883, with mint and sage and rosemary, and a very assertive patch of cilantro that the Mexican ranch hands blessed enthusiastically, and it had grown into a small extravagance of green that she found privately wonderful. Old Pete Dawson retired from active work in the late autumn of 1885, when his knees finally made their opinion about decades of riding known in terms he could not argue with. Vernon built him a small room onto the bunkhouse, proper private quarters with a window and a chair, and Myrtle made sure he came to the main house for supper twice a week, where William would tell him everything he had learned that day about horses, with the comprehensive thoroughness of a 3-year-old who has no concept of a captive audience. Pete appeared to find this entirely acceptable as a way to spend an evening, and he and William developed a bond that, Myrtle suspected, would be one of the defining features of her son's early memory. Silas Greer was still foreman and showed no signs of wanting to be anything else, which was fine with everyone, because a good foreman is one of the most valuable things a working ranch can have, and Silas had the particular quality of being fair without being soft, which meant the men respected him without fearing him, and the work got done well. In the fall of 1886, Vernon expanded the ranch with the purchase of an adjacent parcel of land that had gone back to the county for unpaid taxes, adding 240 acres along the creek bottomland that had excellent grass and a good water source. It was a significant investment, and it stretched the budget, but the logic was sound, and the timing was right, and Myrtle, who had been part of the financial conversations of the ranch for years by that point, agreed with his reasoning fully. The expansion required additional hands, and there was a period of several months that was busy and occasionally chaotic, as new men were brought in and integrated into the existing operation. Myrtle simply made the crew table longer, which was both practically and metaphorically the correct response. William turned 5 in August of 1887 and announced firmly that he intended to be a rancher and a cook, which he had apparently decided were compatible professions based entirely on his observations of his parents. Vernon managed to keep a straight face about this for approximately 30 seconds. Myrtle did not even attempt it. Frances, 2 years old and already exhibiting the considered independence that would characterize her whole life, had by that autumn developed a firm opinion about which people she wanted to sit near at the supper table, which changed weekly, and which she communicated by simply getting up and moving without comment. The crew treated this as entirely normal, which said something good about all of them. Tommy Reyes and Rosa had a son of their own that fall, a child named Marco who arrived plump and vigorous, and who Tommy carried around with the overwhelmed pride of a new father everywhere. Myrtle remembered that pride from Vernon's face and felt the warmth of the memory. The ranch, as the 1880s moved toward their end, had become something that Myrtle could not have pictured when she arrived in the spring of 1882 carrying her cast iron skillet and her carpet bag, with the dust of the road on her hem and the uncertainty of a new place in her chest. It had become, fully and permanently, home. Not in the simple way of houses that are merely inhabited, but in the rich and layered way of places that have absorbed your living, where every room and view and smell is freighted with the accumulated meaning of years. She was 31 now, and still got up before 4 to make the coffee, and still found the kitchen in the early morning, with the stove heating and the light just beginning in the eastern window, to be the finest room in any house she had ever known. The cast iron skillet that she had carried from Caldwell Creek 7 miles in her right hand hung on the same hook where she had placed it on the first day, worn even smoother now from years of daily use, and she reached for it every morning with the comfortable familiarity of reaching for something that has always been exactly where you left it. Vernon was 39 and as steady as he had ever been, though he had acquired, over these years, a quality of ease that had not been present when she first knew him, the ease of a man who has found his footing in all the ways that matter. He still read in the evenings and still drank his coffee before it had properly cooled, and still said important things in plain, direct words, because he did not have another way of saying them, which Myrtle had long ago decided was one of the things she loved most about him. He came to the kitchen one evening in late October of 1887, when the children were in bed and the supper dishes were done, and the ranch had settled into its autumn night quiet, and he stood in the doorway in the way he had stood in doorways on so many evenings, and she looked up from the bread dough she was setting to rise for the morning, and their eyes met with the complete ease of people who have looked at each other so many times that the looking itself is a form of conversation. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "You," he said simply. "That's not a very specific answer." "It is specific," he said, crossing the kitchen with the same unhurried deliberateness he brought to everything, and he put his arms around her from behind in the comfortable, familiar way of a man who has been doing this for years and who still does it intentionally rather than by rote. "I was thinking about the morning you arrived," he said, his voice close to her ear, "with the skillet and the carpet bag and your hair half down from your pins and Sela's looking at you like a man who had received an unexpected telegram." She laughed softly, leaning back against him. "And then I told him there was no misunderstanding." "There was, actually," he said. "I had expected a man. But the misunderstanding turned out to be the best thing that has ever happened to me." She turned in his arms and looked up at him, this husband of hers, this serious good man who had given her a kitchen and a place and himself, and she thought of the woman she had been in April of 1882, 30 miles down that dusty road with her practical skills and her determined jaw and her willingness to go somewhere new, and she was very glad that woman had answered an advertisement for a cook. "Vernon," she said. "Myrtle," he said, "I am going to tell you something that may surprise you." "I doubt it," he said, with that look that was not quite a smile. "I am expecting again," she said. He was still for a moment, and then the not-quite smile became the actual smile, the one that appeared rarely and therefore carried the full weight of his feeling when it did, and he held her more closely and she felt the happiness in him as plainly as she felt her own. "When?" he asked. "May, I think," she said. "The spring again." "This ranch has a great deal of spring in it," he said. "It does," she agreed. "It is one of its very best qualities." The winter of 1887 into 1888 was a hard one, the worst in years, with ice storms that came down from the north in January and kept the ranch housebound for days at a time. The longhorns suffered and some were lost, and the work of keeping the rest alive in the freeze was brutal and relentless. But the kitchen was warm and the food was plentiful, and the crew, snowed in and crowded and occasionally short-tempered, had Myrtle's cooking and her steadiness, and the knowledge that when you came in from the cold, there was always something good waiting, which was more than many people had, and which the men understood, in the particular wordless way of people who have worked hard in difficult conditions, to be a form of grace. Vernon worked himself nearly as hard as he had in the fever week of 1882, and Myrtle watched over him with the same care she had then, making sure he ate and slept, and did not sacrifice his own health to the demands of the crisis. He argued with her about it once, not badly but plainly, saying that she was being overprotective, and she said, equally plainly, that she was carrying his child, and she had certain reasonable requirements about his being alive and well, which argument he could find no position to disagree with, and so he ate and slept as she directed, and they both knew he was grateful for the direction. The losses from that winter were real and set the ranch back considerably, and the first months of 1888 required careful financial management to keep the operation solvent. But they managed it together, Vernon and Myrtle at the kitchen table, with the accounts spread between them, working through the numbers with the pragmatic honesty of two people who have been through difficulties before and know that the way through them is to look directly at them. The third child arrived in the second week of May as predicted, a boy again, born on a morning when the prairie was in full bloom for the second time in the span of Myrtle's memory of it. They named him Robert Henry, and he was, from the first hour, a notably peaceful child who seemed to have surveyed the available options and decided that contentment was the most efficient approach to life. William, who was 5 by now and authoritative about most things, declared his new brother acceptable. Frances, who was 3, sat beside the baby with the focused attention she gave to everything, and Myrtle suspected that this baby would have the most thorough sibling supervision in the history of the Kendrick family. Pete Dawson, who had been declining slowly through the winter in the way of old men whose bodies are simply wearing out, died in his sleep in June of 1888, in his room attached to the bunkhouse, on a warm night when the windows were open and the air smelled of the summer grass. He died at peace and without pain as best they could tell, and Myrtle cried for him in the private way she cried for things she genuinely lost, without performing it. Vernon held her and said nothing, which was exactly right. They buried him in the ranch's small cemetery, under a cottonwood, with a headstone that said Peter Dawson, good cowhand and good company, which was exactly what he had been and what he would have wanted on his stone. Tommy Rays stood at the grave and cried without embarrassment, same as he had at the wedding, and Myrtle loved him for it. The summer of 1888 was easier than the winter that had preceded it, and the cattle prices were better, and the horse operation with Joseph Petta was thriving, and by September the worst of the financial strain from the hard winter had been worked through. Vernon sat at the table with the final accounts for the quarter and said, with the understatement of a man who does not celebrate prematurely, "We are going to be all right." "I know," she said, from the stove where she was making apple butter from the last of the summer apples. "I have known that for quite some time." He looked up from the papers. "Have you?" "Yes," she said. "Since the first year, really. You are not a man who fails at things he has decided to succeed at. It was simply a matter of time and work." "That is a generous assessment," he said. "It is an accurate one," she said, "which is my preference over generous." He came to the stove and kissed her temple, which was a small thing and a daily thing, and which she never stopped being glad for, and then he went back to the accounts, and the evening continued in the warm and particular way of evenings on the Kendrick Ranch. The years rounded out toward 1889, and the decades end with the ranch in its fullest and best shape. The land well used and well tended, the crew competent and in most cases genuinely happy in their work. The Kendrick family grown to 5 with 3 children who were each, in their distinct and different ways, exactly themselves. William at 6 was all motion and questions and unqualified enthusiasm for horses and cooking and old stories, and he had already shown a capacity for kindness toward younger and smaller creatures that told his mother a great deal about the man he would become. Frances at 4 was her own country, systematic and deliberate and funny, in a dry way that she absolutely did not inherit from either parent, and which delighted them both. Robert Henry at 1 was a round, peaceful, laughing presence who had decided that the world was satisfactory and was proceeding accordingly. Myrtle stood on the kitchen steps one morning in the early spring of 1889, in the particular hour before the rest of the ranch was awake, with the first real warmth of the season in the air, and the prairie coming back to green at the edges of the brown winter grass, and she held her coffee cup in both hands the way Vernon held his, which was something she had picked up from him at some point without noticing the transfer. And she looked out at the eastern pasture where the cattle were moving in the early light. 7 years since she had arrived with her skillet and her carpet bag. 7 years of mornings in this kitchen, of the light through that window, of the smell of the stove and the herbs along the south wall. 7 years of this land and these people, this husband, these children, this work that she had chosen and that had, in turn, chosen her. She heard Vernon's boots on the floor inside, the sound of him moving through the house in the early morning as he always did, and then the sound of him pouring a cup of coffee, and then his step at the kitchen door, and he was there beside her in the cool morning with his coffee and his working clothes, and his steady, serious face turned toward the same pasture she was looking at. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. They stood together in the early spring air for a while without speaking, because they had long since discovered that being silent together was one of the richest things available to two people who know each other fully, who have worked and argued and grieved and laughed and built something real in the world together, and who find every morning that the other person is still exactly who they chose. The prairie spread out before them in its enormous, indifferent, beautiful way, and the cattle moved in the pasture, and the horses moved in the corral, and somewhere in the bunkhouse the crew was beginning to stir, and in the room down the hall William was already awake and making the small sounds of a child who is about to get up and require breakfast, and Robert Henry would follow, and Frances would get up last and come to the table with her careful, observing eyes and settle into her chair as though she had surveyed all the available chairs and found this one the most logical choice. And Myrtle Townsend, who had come to cook for a crew and had found instead a life more full and more her own than she had known how to plan for, finished her coffee and went inside to make the morning's biscuits, and Vernon followed her in, and the kitchen filled with warmth and the smell of wood smoke and rising bread, and the day on the Kendrick Ranch began. It was, as all the days on the Kendrick Ranch had become, exactly enough. It was, in fact, everything.